I swear, I still can't wrap my head around what went down. All I wanted to do was check out a cabin, just take a look, that's it. But this woman comes charging out like I'd just strolled into some exclusive country club uninvited. Right away, she starts grilling me at the gate like I didn't belong there. And from that point on, things got strange fast. I'm Mason Hale, and what happened next? Let's just say, it's one for the storybooks, if you're familiar with QA stories. You know HOA folks never fail to deliver. But this one, she went completely off the rails. Ever had someone go on a total power trip for no reason? I'd honestly love to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. Now, after decades of reading people for a living, I can sniff out fake friendliness from a mile away, even if it's smiling behind a clipboard. So, here's how all this started. I'm 42, recently retired from a high-stress career which I'll get into later, and I was looking for a short-term place to relax. Not a forever home, just a peaceful spot to unwind for a few months and figure out my next move. I came across this stunning lakefront cabin in a high-end area called Pine Lake Estates. The owner had listed it online, and after a few phone chats, we scheduled a time for me to visit. Seemed simple enough, right? What could possibly go wrong with a cabin tour? In hindsight, I should have known better. Nothing in my life ever unfolds that neatly. I pulled into Pine Lake Estates on a picture-perfect Tuesday morning, and I have to admit, the place was beautiful. Immaculate lawns, spotless driveways, enormous homes lining the water, each with pristine docks stretching into the lake's clear blue surface. The kind of neighborhood where you'd expect to see kids biking around and families grilling out on weekends. But as I reached the gated entrance, something felt off. Hard to put into words, but after 22 years in law enforcement, you develop a feel for situations, and this place felt over-monitored and oddly sterile. Cameras weren't just aimed at the entry, they were angled in strange directions, with blind spots that looked way too intentional. That's when I met Susan Mercer. She appeared out of nowhere. While I was still figuring out how to buzz in, she came striding toward my vehicle with a face that practically shouted, "You don't belong here." Mid-50s, hair perfectly done, dressed in pricey athletic wear, carrying herself like she ran the entire neighborhood. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" she snapped, before I could even finish rolling down my window. No greeting, no offer to help, just straight to the interrogation. I kept my cool. Maybe she was just being cautious, I thought. I explained, "I'm here to view the lakefront cabin rental. I have an appointment with the owner." My tone was calm and deliberate, old habits from years of diffusing tense situations. But instead of easing up, her expression hardened even more. "Oh, that property," she said, like the words tasted bitter. "I'm afraid it's not really suitable for someone like you." Someone like me? That phrase hit hard. Alarm bells immediately started going off in my head. "I'm sorry, what do you mean by someone like me?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. I was well-dressed, driving a clean car, acting respectfully. What was it about me she found unacceptable? "At Pine Lake Estates, we have certain standards," she replied, giving me a slow, judgmental once-over. "We prefer established families with proper backgrounds." Proper backgrounds. There it was. I'd heard that phrase too many times in my former job, and it never meant anything good. The subtext wasn't even subtle. Before I could respond, she called out, "John, please escort this gentleman out. People like him make our residents feel unsafe. People like him. Not this man who's acting suspicious." Just a blanket dismissal. I saw the security guard start walking over, clearly uncomfortable with what was unfolding. He looked like he didn't want any part of it. That's when I really started taking in my surroundings. The camera angles, the properties with for sale signs only in front of homes owned by non-white families, the way Susan kept looking around like she was performing for some invisible audience. A woman across the street had paused in her gardening, staring directly at us with an expression caught between curiosity and concern. I recognized this entire playbook. The veiled language, the unequal treatment, the way the rules shifted depending on who you were. My old instincts kicked in, and I began mentally documenting every detail. But I also knew I was standing at a crossroads. I could walk away, pretend it didn't happen, and look for another place. Or I could push back and see how deep this actually went. "Mom, are you familiar with fair housing laws?" I asked, keeping my voice even and professional. The transformation on her face was instant. That superior, smug attitude dissolved into something much shakier, part panic, part fury. "That's none of your concern," she fired back. But I could see the gears turning. She was calculating whether I actually knew what I was talking about or was just bluffing. The woman across the street had now dropped her hose completely. Water pooled at her feet as she listened in. "I worked in law enforcement," I said cautiously, watching her response. "This situation feels very familiar." She flinched just a little, but enough for a trained eye to catch. She was clearly scrambling now, probably wondering, had she just discriminated against an undercover cop? Was this conversation being recorded? Was she about to be arrested right there in front of her pristine community? Part of me felt like I should have put her out of her misery and revealed exactly who I was. But another part, I was curious to see where she'd take it. Would she come to her senses, or keep digging? The security guard had paused halfway to my car, clearly picking up on the shift in tension. Across the street, another woman had joined the spectator, both now openly watching. Susan's hands trembled as she clutched her clipboard, and I noticed sweat beginning to bead on her forehead. Despite the crisp air, "Mr. What was your name again?" she asked, voice tight and clipped. "Hale," I replied. "Mason Hale." She muttered my name to herself like she was etching it into memory. At that moment, I could tell this wasn't over. She was already planning her next move. Her whole expression hardened, like she'd swallowed something gritty, and that look in her eyes, I'd seen it before in the suspects who thought they were always one step ahead of the system. As I pulled away from the gate, I caught her in the rearview mirror, already on her phone, dialing with the desperation of someone who just declared war. Back then, I had no idea this woman was about to turn a routine rental inquiry into a full-blown federal civil rights issue. But some people just don't know when to stop digging their own holes. The moment I mentioned law enforcement, her entire demeanor shifted, and instead of backing off like any reasonable person, Susan Mercer chose to double down. Maybe I should have just left it alone, I don't know. But something about her attitude made me want to see just how far this rabbit hole went. So I made a decision, maybe not the wisest one. I decided to go through the official rental application process for that same cabin. The very next day, I called Susan directly and told her I'd like to move forward with the application. There was a long silence on the line, like she was trying to figure out whether this was a trap. "Mr. Hale," she finally said, lacing her voice with forced politeness, "please understand that our application process is quite extensive. We take community safety and compatibility very seriously at Pine Lake Estates." Community safety, compatibility, more loaded terms that made my skin crawl. "I appreciate thoroughness," I told her calmly. "I assume you follow all the appropriate legal protocols." Another pause. "Of course. Everything we do is by the book." "Completely legal," she said, a little too emphatically. I could tell she'd already spoken to someone, probably a lawyer, about how much hot water she might be in. 3 days later, the paperwork arrived, and it was absolutely absurd. It didn't look like a rental application. It looked like something from a federal security clearance file. Page after page of background checks, personality evaluations, even questions cleverly disguised to probe political views. Most rental forms are what, 2, maybe 3 pages? This one was a 15-page monstrosity. They wanted a decade of employment history with full contact info, 4 references who'd known me for 5 years or more, full credit and background checks, and something they called a community compatibility assessment, which wasn't explained anywhere. When I called to ask what that meant, Susan's assistant, who sounded absolutely miserable, by the way, told me it was a standard measure to ensure residents aligned with our community values. Here's what really got me. You could buy a house, get married, and plant a garden in the time this process took. Application reviews typically take 4 to 6 weeks, the cover letter stated. 4 to 6 weeks. For a cabin rental. I've seen people close on homes faster. Naturally, I started digging. Not sure why. I guess after 20 years in law enforcement, I couldn't ignore patterns once I saw them. I made a few calls, started asking around about others who tried renting in Pine Lake recently. What I found wasn't exactly shocking, but it was disgusting. 3 families had pulled their applications the previous year after being strung along for months. All 3 were minorities. One was a young black couple with twin toddlers. Another was a Latino family. The father was a doctor. The third was an Asian family that owned a small business. Meanwhile, white applicants were typically approved within A week, sometimes even faster. I was able to track down one of the families who had ultimately given up on their application, and the conversation was eye-opening. "Don't waste your time, man," the guy told me over the phone. He refused to give his name and I couldn't blame him. "They've got this whole system set up to keep certain people out," he said. I gave it 3 months. Every time I submitted something, they asked for more paperwork, more references, more background checks. That's when things really started to get strange. Susan began emailing me almost daily with new requirements, additional documentation for a community safety evaluation, more references for a neighborhood compatibility review. Then came one that really caught my attention: an extended background check, apparently needed due to my former career in law enforcement. That one stopped me in my tracks. According to her, my experience as a police officer was somehow a red flag in their assessment of community safety. I had to read that email 3 separate times to convince myself someone had actually written it. Did she seriously believe that made any sense? A former cop being labeled a risk in a gated neighborhood. The irony was so thick it practically begged to be sliced. I decided to respond, just to see what would happen. I sent a courteous, professional message asking whether these were routine steps for all applicants, and if she could cite the specific legal grounds for some of these rather odd requests. I even added a note for the record: to my knowledge, federal housing policy doesn't yet include personality screenings for neighborhoods. Her reply came within 2 hours, which, considering everything else had dragged on for days, felt suspiciously fast. "Mr. Hale," she wrote, "our application procedures were carefully developed in consultation with legal counsel to ensure full compliance with all relevant laws. If our comprehensive screening process makes you uncomfortable, perhaps Pine Lake Estates isn't the right fit for you." The message was clear: take the hint and walk away. Then Susan made a misstep. She called me. I could hear the tension in her voice before she even spoke. "What exactly do you do for a living, Mr. Hale?" she asked, like she was conducting a background interview. Looking back, I probably should have just told her the truth then and there. It would have saved us both a lot of time. But something about her tone made me want to keep playing along. "I'm a consultant," I said, which was technically true. "I help organizations stay compliant with federal regulations." She went quiet for a moment. I could almost hear her typing my name into Google in her head. "What kind of compliance?" she asked finally. Her voice had a nervous edge now. "Civil rights compliance, mostly. Fair housing, equal opportunity. Things like that." It wasn't a lie. That's been the core of my consulting work since I retired. But I wasn't quite ready to lay out my entire background just yet. I've worked with a number of communities where discriminatory practices were an issue. I added. Another pause. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I hope you're not suggesting that Pine Lake Estates discriminates in any way." "I'm not suggesting anything, Ms. Mercer," I replied. "I'm simply documenting what I observe." And that was the truth. I'd been keeping detailed records, every interaction, every email, every absurd request. There was a part of me that wanted to just come clean then and there and be done with it. But I was also curious. I wanted to see how far she was willing to go. After that call, I had a pretty good sense of the kind of situation I was dealing with. A small part of me felt guilty until I remembered that young couple with twin toddlers who had been jerked around for months. That's when my sympathy vanished. So I decided to ask for an in-person meeting at the HOA office. When I brought it up, there was another long pause. Those were quickly becoming Susan's signature. "I suppose we could meet," she said eventually, probably thinking she could gain the upper hand face-to-face on her own turf. "Thursday at 2 o'clock. My office, at the community center." She put real emphasis on my office, like that was going to intimidate me. The Pine Lake Estates Community Center was exactly what you'd expect. Polished stone, gleaming glass, and landscaping that screamed money. The kind of place that's meant to impress or quietly push you out, depending on who you are. I arrived right on time. Susan was seated behind a huge mahogany desk, looking like she was about to chair a board meeting. She had a neat stack of papers laid out in front of her and wore one of those corporate smiles that never reached the eyes. In the corner, a security camera blinked red. I made sure it captured everything. "Mr. Hale," she said as I sat down, "I don't appreciate you questioning our established protocols." Her assistant, a 30-something woman with nervous eyes, kept avoiding my gaze and fiddling with files at a nearby desk. "I'm not questioning them," I said calmly. "I'm documenting them." That smile vanished in an instant. Documenting. For what, exactly? She tried to sound firm, but the uncertainty leaked through. Pattern. Analysis, I answered. I've seen this play out before in other communities. That wasn't completely accurate. I'd mostly worked on employment discrimination cases, but the principles were close enough. She didn't need my full resume. I began outlining the inconsistencies I'd noticed in their process keeping. It plain and easy to understand. Applicants being fast-tracked while others faced never-ending hurdles. Documentation demands that seemed to change depending on who was applying. Procedures that had no clear legal basis. I watched as Susan's face grew redder with every point. She kept cutting in with explanations that made no sense, but I just kept my tone steady, something I'd perfected over decades of dealing with people who assumed they were above the law. By now, her assistant looked like she was trying to disappear into her chair. She knew Susan was way out of her depth. Are you some kind of lawyer trying to build a case? Susan finally blurted out. I looked at her. Did she really think only lawyers understood civil rights law? Not a lawyer, I said, but I do know housing law and I know discrimination when I see it. Her face drained of color. Mr. Hale, that's a very serious accusation. Yes, it is, I agreed. That's why I don't make it lightly. That's when she shifted into panic mode. She started threatening to call the police, said I. Was harassing her, disrupting the peace of the community, just for asking questions. Then she pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of me. She said she was documenting everything for legal purposes. I actually laughed. Ms. Mercer, you're photographing me sitting calmly in a chair during a meeting you scheduled. What exactly are you hoping your attorney does with that? Her assistant looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. That's when I decided to drop the bomb. Before you escalate this any further, I said, you should know I've already filed a formal complaint. Her phone slipped right out of her hand and hit the desk. A complaint with who exactly? She asked, her voice shaking. With the people responsible for investigating housing discrimination. I didn't clarify whether I meant the local agency, the state office, or the federal government. Let her imagination run with it. When I said the words discrimination case, the blood seemed to drain right out of her. At that point, I knew I stood at a crossroads. I could end it right, then tell her exactly who I was, what I'd done, and why I was here, or I could stay quiet and let her keep digging herself deeper. I'm still not sure which would have been the better choice. Part of me wanted to put her out of her misery, but the part of me that had spent years investigating people who abused power, that part wanted to see how far she'd go. Mr. Hale, she said, her voice now trembling. I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. Pine Lake Estates complies with all relevant laws. We've never discriminated against anyone. Well, then, I replied, you should have no problem with a formal investigation. People who haven't done anything wrong usually welcome the chance to clear their name. She locked eyes with me for what felt like ages, and I could practically see her mind racing, trying to decide whether I was bluffing or if she was staring down a legal disaster that could dismantle everything she'd worked for. What do you want? She finally asked, her voice tinged with a kind of panic. The question caught me off guard. Was I blowing things out of proportion? Her tone made it seem like she was trying to strike a deal. I told her, I want your community to obey the law. I want every applicant to be treated fairly, no matter their race or background. And I want the families you pushed out with your discriminatory policies to get the apology they deserve. She sat there silently for a while, staring at her hands. When she finally looked up, her whole demeanor had shifted. Gone was the smug, domineering woman I'd dealt with. Now, she looked genuinely terrified. Her assistant had stopped pretending to work. She was flat out staring, probably debating whether to start job hunting. How do I know you're not just here to ruin us? She asked, and for a brief second, I felt a shred of sympathy. But then I thought of the families she'd mistreated, and the feeling vanished. Ms. Mercer, I'm not here to destroy anyone, I said. I'm here to fix a broken system. There's a difference. I couldn't tell if she believed me, but at that point, it didn't matter. The choices she'd made were already in motion, and consequences were coming whether she understood that or not. The irony, she still thought she was winning. She had no idea she'd just handed me a legal time bomb with her name stamped on it. As I left her office, I heard her frantically dialing, likely calling every lawyer she knew. Susan had stared at me for what felt like forever when I brought up the formal complaint. I could almost see her brain stalling out, scrambling to figure out her next step. I wish I could say I stayed calm through the tense silence, but honestly, I started to second-guess myself. Was I truly holding her accountable, or was I overstepping, trying to play judge and jury in a community she'd created? Maybe I should have just walked away and found another place to live. But then I remembered that family with the twin toddlers, and I knew I couldn't let it go. What happened next? I never saw it coming. Instead of apologizing or negotiating, Susan spiraled into full-blown panic. Within an hour, she was on the phone with the HOA's attorney, demanding an emergency meeting. I know because a kind older neighbor, who had been quietly following the situation, called to give me a heads up. "She's not falling apart," she said. "She's strategizing, running damage control like a CEO in crisis mode. That woman is absolutely losing it. She's been on the phone and email nonstop all day. She's trying to get you permanently banned and is threatening a restraining order for stalking and harassment. Stalking and harassment for asking questions about a rental." I had to laugh. The whole community was starting to take sides. Some residents backed Susan completely. "He's just causing drama," I heard one man say. "We moved here for peace and quiet, not lawsuits and chaos." But others were whispering different opinions. One woman leaned in and quietly said, "She's been calling black families visually disruptive for years. We all noticed. We just didn't say anything." That conversation was as revealing as it was infuriating. People knew what was going on, but no one had spoken up. Rather than get emotional or defensive, I decided to rely on what I'd been trained to do: document everything. But this wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. I was building a case. This time, the walls were closing in on her. I began recording conversations with Susan's consent, photographing any discriminatory signage or policies I could find, and collecting written testimonies from residents willing to share their stories. There was something oddly therapeutic about falling back into that investigative routine I'd known for so long. At the same time, I realized that my calm, methodical approach was likely driving Susan deeper into paranoia. She couldn't figure me out. Was I just some nosy guy with time to kill, or someone much more dangerous to her little regime? That's when Susan made the worst mistake in this entire ordeal. She sent me a formal letter on HOA letterhead so legally flawed I had to read it 3 times to believe it was real. "You are hereby banned from this community," the letter declared. "Any further communication with residents or HOA members will be considered criminal harassment and reported to authorities. Your rental application is permanently denied due to disruptive behavior and failure to meet community standards." Criminal harassment for asking questions, standards that were never clearly outlined. She'd handed me clear evidence of retaliation and had put it in writing with her signature. I called her immediately. "Ms. Mercer, the letter you just sent may be considered retaliation under federal law. You might want to consult an attorney before sending anything else." The silence on the line was deafening. "What do you mean, retaliation?" she asked finally, her voice laced with fear. "It's illegal to punish someone for filing a discrimination complaint or asserting their civil rights," I explained. "That letter could be seen as exactly that." Another long pause. "I was just protecting the community," she muttered. "Protecting it from what?" I asked. "From someone questioning your application process." That evening, I walked past the clubhouse. The string lights were dim, but I saw her pacing behind the glass, phone pressed to her ear, panicked. I'd told stories like this before on panels, podcasts, in training rooms. But living one, I never imagined I'd find myself in the center of a case like this. Life has a strange sense of irony. I was supposed to be enjoying retirement, and here I was smack in the middle of the very kind of civil rights case I'd once investigated. Only now, I was the one under attack. It felt surreal, frustrating, and, in a strange way, satisfying. More residents started stepping forward with stories about Susan. Mrs. Miller, an Asian woman whose family had lived in the community for 3 years, described the endless complaints Susan filed against them. Different rules, constant nitpicking. She told me, our kids playing outside, guests using visitor parking, even how we keep our garden. She always finds fault, but only with us. This wasn't about personal conflicts. It was a consistent pattern: discrimination thinly veiled as enforcement. And, instead of facing it, Susan went nuclear. She called 911. I found out later what she told the dispatcher. "I need police at Lakefront Estates immediately. There's a man harassing the community." He says he's a government investigator, but I think he's lying. He's dangerous. He's threatening people. Government investigator, dangerous, threatening. Every word a lie or a gross distortion. She was desperate, willing to say anything to weaponize law enforcement against me. What would you do in my shoes? Stay calm or fight back. When someone lies to the police and paints you as a threat, it's human nature to get angry. But I knew better. I'd learned that when officers arrive, the smartest move is to stay calm, cooperate fully, and let the facts do the talking. As the sirens grew louder, my chest tightened. She'd just made the worst mistake of her life and she didn't even know it. Or maybe I had made the mistake by letting things escalate this far. Either way, change was coming fast and there was no turning back. The sirens got louder. My heart pounded, not out of fear of police. After 22 years in law enforcement, I didn't rattle easily, but I was concerned about the line Susan had just crossed and what would happen next. Two patrol cars pulled up to the community center. 2 officers stepped out. Officer Rodriguez looked like a seasoned pro 40s, calm, unreadable. Officer Kim was younger, sharp-eyed, still with that energy new cops carry. Susan ran toward them before they could shut their doors, words tumbling out of her mouth. Officers, thank God. He's been harassing us for weeks. He claims to be a federal investigator, but I know he's lying. He's threatening residents, intimidating the HOA, federal investigator. I had to admire the spin. She'd taken a comment about my background and twisted it into something far more dramatic. But seeing her flailing like that, it was clear she was unraveling. Officers, I said as they approached, keeping my tone steady, I'm happy to cooperate. There seems to be a serious misunderstanding here. Rodriguez gave me a neutral nod. Sir, can you explain your side? I applied to rent here. When I was denied, I asked whether the process was fair and lawful. That's my right. Simple, direct, no theatrics. But Susan wouldn't let me control the narrative. He's lying. He told me he worked for the government. He's been threatening legal action, scaring people. I turned and looked at her. You'd think I'd been running around with a bullhorn yelling threats. The way she was spinning it. Ma'am, I said, I never said I worked for the government. I told you I do consulting on compliance issues. When I see potential violations, I report them legally. That's what any responsible citizen should do. Officer Kim stepped forward. Sir, we're going to need to see some ID, of course, I said. I always cooperate with law enforcement, and that's when everything came to a head. I saw the expression on Susan's face shift, confident, gloating. She was sure the truth was about to come out, that I was a fraud. She probably thought the officers would expose me as a fake and arrest me for false reporting or harassment. I wanted to ask, what do you think I'm about to show them? But I stayed quiet and reached for my wallet. The leather case was familiar, same kind I'd carried for over 20 years. I might have been retired, but I still had consulting credentials that clarify exactly who I was. More importantly, the ID I carried would make everything clear, exactly who Susan had been dealing with these past 2 weeks. As my fingers closed around that credential case, I couldn't help but wonder, was I finally bringing closure or opening the door to a whole new mess? Even then, a part of me was still unsure. Had I pushed too hard? Should I have just walked away? Was I really about to shame someone who was more clueless and power-thirsty than truly evil? But then my mind went to Mrs. Miller, that young couple with twins, and so many others who'd been mistreated by Susan's biased regime. They deserved more than to have their rights steamrolled by someone who believed her role as HOA president gave her the right to decide who belonged here. Officer Rodriguez stood by, calmly waiting for my ID. I noticed Officer Kim shift subtly to the side, standard move when an officer isn't sure whether a situation might escalate. All right, I muttered, reaching into my pocket. This should clear things up. That might have been the understatement of the entire year. Instead of pulling out a basic driver's license like Susan was likely anticipating, I retrieved the leather credential holder I'd carried for over 20 years. Rodriguez and Kim instantly recognized it. Anyone who's spent even a short time in law enforcement knows the look of official credentials. Then Susan caught sight of the badge, and her smirk cracked like glass. The second that case opened and I handed it to Officer Rodriguez, the entire scene shifted. She was still grinning, probably assuming I was about to show off some knockoff badge or outdated security license that would confirm all her suspicions. But when I handed over that ID, the game changed. Federal credentials, retired chief of police. still active under civil rights consulting clearance. Rodriguez examined the badge, then looked straight at me and stood a little taller. Chief, sir, we had no idea. The word chief landed like a grenade. Susan's victorious smile froze mid-expression. I watched her face tighten as the meaning sank in. Her pupils shrank like she'd just lost oxygen. Altitude sickness caused by falling from the power she thought she had. Retired, I clarified. But I still consult on civil rights cases when there are indicators of systemic bias. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a strange squeak came out. Her eyes locked on the badge like she couldn't believe what was in front of her. Police chief. You're really? She whispered. 22 years in law enforcement, I said. Retired chief. Now I focus on investigating discrimination and civil rights violations in communities like this. That's when the reality of what she'd done began to crush her. Every hostile email, every discriminatory policy, every retaliatory threat documented, backed by someone with the authority to make it count. The emails in my inbox were no longer just harassment, they were evidence. Time-stamped, cross-referenced, and ready for court. Officer Kim glanced between us. Chief, is there currently an active investigation into this HOA? There is now, I told him. Ms. Mercer's leadership shows concerning trends that warrant immediate review. By then, the noise had drawn out neighbors. Word spread fast. He's a real federal housing inspector, someone whispered. She called the cops on a police chief. Another added. In minutes, a dozen, maybe 20 residents stood nearby, watching everything unfold. Then Mrs. Miller stepped forward, shaky voice, but unmistakably brave. Officers, she said, this woman has been unfairly targeting minority families in our neighborhood for years. She applies rules differently depending on who you are. It's blatant discrimination. Murmurs of agreement followed. Neighbors nodded. She files complaints about our kids using the play area. But white families' kids, not a word, Mrs. Miller continued. She reports our guests for parking violations, but ignores others doing the same thing. Even how we tend our garden, only a problem when it's us. Susan stood there, paralyzed, like her clipboard had become Exhibit A. I could see it hit her entire scheme had just imploded. And worse, she'd made her legal situation 10 times messier by lying to the police. From the back of the crowd, someone whispered, she called internal affairs on herself. That drew uncomfortable laughter, awkward at first, but growing. More voices chimed in. She told us our BBQ smoke was disturbing others, but the white family next door grills every weekend. She filed a complaint about our kids being too loud in the playground. But only after she learned we were Hispanic. It was like a dam had broken. Years of quiet frustration finally spilled out. Rodriguez handed my badge back with visible respect. Chief, how do you want to handle the false report she filed? That's your call, I said. But knowingly filing a false police report in retaliation for someone exercising their civil rights, that's a criminal offense. He didn't have to say arrest, but the weight of the word was heavy. In the air, Susan made a strangled noise, like she was trying to speak but couldn't push past the shame. For a second, I actually pitied her, almost. Then I remembered what she'd done to every minority family trying to find a home here, and that pity vanished. Ms. Mercer, I said, my voice level, every email, every action, every threat, it's all part of an active civil rights case now. Again, she tried to speak. Again, only that odd squeak came out. The officers did their jobs, taking detailed statements from residents. Susan stood frozen as her neighbors, once silent, turned their backs on her. Rodriguez's expression was the kind reserved for people who waste a cop's time. Ma'am, he said, filing a false report is serious, especially when it's used to retaliate against someone upholding civil rights. Chief Hale is here on official business. Susan's lips moved. No words. The power she'd clung to had evaporated, and with it, her script. Still reeling, she finally mumbled, I didn't know. I thought he was just stirring up trouble. But the damage was done, and the consequences came fast. By sunrise, she was out. No farewell meeting, no speech, just an emergency resignation letter. She stepped down, citing unforeseen personal circumstances. The HOA board wasted no time holding an emergency meeting to distance themselves from her actions and avoid potential federal violations and hefty penalties. They acted quickly and decisively. Throwing her under the bus was their only hope of survival. Federal civil rights investigators began combing through everything: policies, applications, meeting minutes, the charges, civil rights violations, systemic housing discrimination, abuse of authority under color of law. Turns out, this wasn't just about my rental. It was a long-standing pattern: targeted harassment to keep certain families out of Pine Lake Estates. The first thing to go was the HOA bulletin board. Literally, one neighbor yanked it down with a crowbar and a big grin. The new HOA president, Mr. Johnson, made his debut announcement. All discriminatory policies were revoked, and formal apologies would be issued to every affected family. This community will follow the law, he declared. No more loopholes, no more favoritism. Suddenly, residents who once lived in fear felt safe enough to participate fully. Transparent rules, equal treatment. A new welcome committee formed to help every newcomer feel at home. The vibe shifted instantly. Children from every background played freely in shared spaces. The air felt lighter, and Susan, she didn't fight back, she just disappeared. No dramatic exit, no protests, just silence. A week later, I ran into her at the grocery store. She saw me, looked down, and scurried away. There was something undeniably sad about her. A woman who let petty power and deep-rooted bias ruin her life. She wasn't pure evil, just scared, willfully ignorant, and drunk on a title she thought gave her unchecked control. But actions have consequences, and they were well-earned. I rented that cabin at fair market value. The owner was relieved. Thank you for standing up to her, he told me when we signed the lease. We all knew, but no one had the courage. That made every second of the ordeal worth it. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to stand up and say, enough, this ends now. The changes came fast and visibly. A new sign went up at the neighborhood entrance: Pine Lake Estates, a community that truly welcomes everyone. At the first neighborhood barbecue, Mrs. Miller raised her glass, teary-eyed. Behind her, children of all colors chased fireflies, without judgment. Thank you for giving us back our voices, she said. A black resident added, now my kids finally feel like they belong here. A young mom shared, we were ready to move, but now we're staying to help rebuild. 6 months later, I sit peacefully on my deck, watching families of every background enjoying the lake together. Laughter floats over the water. With new leadership, the community flourished, and yes, even property values rose once the discrimination stopped. Susan left quietly, no forwarding address. The investigation ended with a major settlement, funding diversity and inclusion programs county-wide. In the end, the most powerful victories are the quiet ones where everyone wins, except for hate and bias. Housing discrimination is still out there, but it doesn't have to win. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to say, this ends here. I thought retirement meant stepping away from fighting injustice, but sometimes injustice shows up on your doorstep. And when it does, you have a choice: walk away, or use everything you've learned to make things right. Turns out, the strongest badge I ever carried wasn't in my wallet. It was the quiet trust this community gave me without saying a word. That's worth more than any courtroom victory. Maybe this story isn't about titles or takedowns. Maybe it's about this: when you show up with integrity, sometimes the entire block finds its voice too. If you're still here, I'd love to know your thoughts. Ever seen something like this happen in your area? If this resonated and you want to show support, that little thanks button is right below. Stay bold, stay loud, and never underestimate the power of quiet authority.